Austerity. It's big in Europe. It's getting big here. Everyone and the Prime Minister has been talking about it. But what is it? It's the common sense on how to pay for the massive increase in public debt caused by the financial crisis, mostly through the slashing of government services. First you take on debt, then you pay it off. Sounds simple, right?
This school of thought takes as a starting point the assumption that the classically liberal value of freedom of the individual is not just a means to an end, but demands respect as a value on its own. Springing from this is the conviction that individuals, acting freely without guidance or coercion by the state, will create the best form of what Professor Hayek calls the social order. Much of Hayek's work has been devoted to explaining the consequences of attempting to create other social orders, either by deliberate planning or by other, more socialist interventions in the workings of the market.
This has really started in the early 80s. It was characterized by what people called at that time the Reagan-Thatcher era. It was the beginning of the neoliberal onslaught of a package of economic policy measures, which was applied both in the developed countries, particularly Europe and North America, as well as in the developing countries in a somewhat different context. In the West, it was characterized by the concentration of corporate capital. Increased mergers and acquisitions took place in an atmosphere of deregulation of the real economy. It was also characterized by the beginning of austerity measures, the crisis of the social sectors, the welfare state, particularly in Western Europe. And eventually this evolved towards a major financial meltdown, first in 1981, as we recall, and again in 1987. What was characteristic of those two meltdowns was the absence of a regulatory environment. So that in a sense what was happening was the scrapping of economic regulation, where the financial markets in agreement with the governments, I'm talking about Wall Street versus the US Treasury, essentially told the government, we will regulate ourselves, so that they had an internal process of regulation, but government regulation of financial occurrences, mechanisms, speculation was a no-no. And that has been the tendency, I would say, since 1987. It's the repeal of the regulatory environment, and it ultimately, the climax of that process is in 1999 with the adoption of what is called the Financial Services Modernization Act, adopted under the Clinton administration, with Larry Summers at the time was Secretary of the Treasury. And that's a big landmark because it's also the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which had been enacted during the Great Depression and which essentially purported to separate commercial banking from the activities of stock brokerage firms, in other words, the merchant banks, and to avoid instability which would result precisely from this speculative activity, insider trade, and so on.
Progressive Democrats can claim to be, have revolutionised in many ways Irish society.
All we have to do is look at our economy to recognise the impact that our party has had over the last 20 years.
Progressive Democrats intend to put before the Irish people a comprehensive agenda setting out our vision for tomorrow's Ireland. Central to that vision is our commitment to keep Ireland prosperous, competitive and economically strong. A key element of our formula for economic success has been and remains our determination to bring about sustained reform of our taxation system. We are no Johnny-come-latelys to low tax rates or to the concept of freeing people's incomes so that they can make a good life for themselves and their families. Governments don't create prosperity, people do. Governments don't own prosperity, people do. Tax reform means sharing prosperity with the people who create it.
The government is also increasing the mortgage tax relief available to first-time buyers. I'm announcing a cut in the standard rate of VAT, reduce the standard rate and the higher rate of income tax. This side of the House anticipates that we'll be drinking loads of champagne after the summer next year.
We were like Icarus. We flew too close to the sun. We became over-ambitious.
It was a tsunami of economic events.
It was almost as if people were spellbound. That they were like, the rabbit in the headlights, with what was happening around them.
The tricolour still flew over government buildings, but it was clear there was a new show in town. Or was it?
Is it just total fiction?
It is fiction. We have not applied. There are no negotiations going on. If there were, obviously government would be aware of it, and we are not aware of it.
There has been no question of the government, as was being stated all over the weekend, in a negotiation for a bailout. And those sort of pejorative terms don't assist either, by the way.
Austerity. Austerity.
I can speak for Iceland, and I absolutely think the system like it is here today has nothing to do with democracy. The country is controlled by political parties, and they have their own agenda, which has not very much to do with the good of the general public, which democracy should be about.
The way we have done democracy up till now, that system simply doesn't have the legitimacy it had before the crash.
4 years ago we were exhibit number one of a failed financial system, but now we are back on recovery with economic growth and very little unemployment. And I think the primary reason is that we were wise enough to realize this was also a fundamental social and political crisis, but above all we didn't follow the traditional prevailing orthodoxies of the Western world in the last 30 years. We introduced currency controls, we let the banks fail, we provided support for the poor, we didn't introduce austerity measures of the scale you're seeing here in Europe. And the end result, 4 years later, is that Iceland is enjoying progress and recovery very different from the other European countries that suffered from the financial crisis.
The general public might have funny ideas about corporate control. For example, people who really believe in democracy, people who take 18th century values seriously, people who really might merit the term conservatives, that much abused term, are against concentration of power. They remember that after all, the doctrines of the Enlightenment held that individuals should be free from the coercion of concentrated power. Now, the kind of concentrated power that they were thinking about was the church and the state and the feudal system and so on. And you could sort of imagine a population of relatively equal people, at least equal white male property owners, who would be not controlled by those private powers. But in the subsequent period, a new form of power developed, namely corporations, with highly concentrated power over decision-making in economic life. That is, they control over what's produced, what's distributed, what's invested, and so on and so forth, is very narrowly concentrated.
So this is why the vice president of a large corporation would say the public mind is the chief.
The public mind might have funny ideas about democracy, which say that we should not be forced simply to rent ourselves to the people who own the country, and own its institutions. Rather, we should play a role in determining what those institutions do. That's democracy. If we were to move towards democracy, and I think democracy even in the 18th century sense, we would say that there should be no maldistribution of power in determining what's produced, what's distributed, what's invested, and so on. Rather, that should be that's a problem for the entire community. In fact, there are, in my own personal view, unless we move in that direction, human society probably isn't going to survive.
In a country with direct democracy, people can participate directly in politics. Everyone can help decide how the state, the cantons, and the communities are organized. In the whole of Switzerland, residents vote on average 4 times a year on various issues concerning their community, their canton, or the whole of the country. For example, they can vote on whether to have a new school built in the village, on how the canton should produce its electricity, or on the state old age pension plan.
In addition, every 4 years the people elect the 246 members of the National Parliament, which consists of 2 chambers. The House of Representatives, representing the people, and the Senate, representing the cantons. This system gives less populated cantons more political weight.